It's been more than 20 years since 9/11. We're still taking our shoes off at the airport. It's been more than 15 years since a failed plot to detonate liquid explosives. We're still measuring 3.4 ounces of toothpaste. And it's been more than 5 years since Get Out was released.
How can I get in trouble for patting down an old lady? It's standard procedure.
And it's still standard procedure to invade people's privacy.
There's absolutely zero evidence that the TSA is doing anything to keep us safer. So we're trading off on the liberty margin, but we're not gaining anything on the security margin. And if anything, we might actually be losing on that margin too.
The Transportation Security Administration is a waste of time and money. So what if we just did away with the TSA? Airports used to be cool. Top-notch restaurants, high-end shops with good deals, and you could greet a loved one right at their gate, all without a boarding pass.
I'm sorry, you cannot go any further without a boarding pass.
No, but you know...
A lot of people think about airport security and the TSA as being just this synonymous thing, this idea that the TSA has always been there, but that's actually not the case. People used to have what were called airport meetings. So you would fly people, or people would fly to a particular airport, have their meetings in the airport, and then fly back out. You don't see those types of things, at least not very much anymore.
Everything changed after 9/11 when President George W. Bush created the TSA. Ever since, Americans have been told to be skeptical of unattended baggage and personal items. We've been told to be suspicious of our fellow citizens. If you see something, say something. And taxpayers have been forced to pay for it.
What the literature points to is that bureaus, absent profit and loss signals, measure their success by maximizing or growing their budget, and by trying to increase the number of subordinate personnel within their organizational structure. And so there is this continued push then in bureaucratic institutions to continuously expand your budget. How do you do that? You do that by exhausting your budget and then requesting more the following year, and expanding the number of personnel that you have.
The replacement of freedom with fear at American airports is exactly what Al-Qaeda's terrorists wanted. But even bin Laden's wildest dreams couldn't have foreseen the hypocrisy.
What about the liquid? What?
Yeah. We all know how much devastation we can wreak with 3.5 ounces of liquid.
The damage is incalculable.
The crafty TSA, they have limited passengers to only 3.4 ounces. Damn it!
TSA PreCheck suggests that if you have $85 lying around, you're no longer a threat. Special exemptions for children and elderly folks? If preventing terrorism were so important, surely that wouldn't fly.
I mean, a lot of security experts have pointed out these types of exemptions that the TSA grants are not particularly effective at enhancing security, and essentially just are arbitrary distinctions.
Even in the middle of the pandemic, TSA agents would tell you to pull down your mask, which they mandated you wear, so they could match your ID to your face. The TSA's hassles and harassment push people, consciously or otherwise, to drive instead of fly. And because driving is more dangerous than flying, the TSA is actively making Americans less safe. All this to stop terrorism, which has been incredibly rare on commercial flights since they began more than 100 years ago.
One of the things that I think people don't often appreciate is the fact that flying was an incredibly safe mode of transportation with respect to terror risk, and this is including 9/11. If you repeated 9/11 every month for several years, you still wouldn't crack the top 10 in terms of causes of death in the United States in a given year.
And still, the TSA continues with its heartless hassling and outright embarrassment of passengers.
There's one story that's been told frequently about a cancer survivor by the name of Thomas Sawyer. And he is a bladder cancer survivor. He has a medical device which essentially allows him to collect the urine from his body or outside of his body in a bag. When he was flying, he alerted the TSA agents that he had this medical device. The TSA agents did not listen to this. They effectively broke the seal on the bag. And so by the time he got to his flight, he was covered in urine and then had to change his clothes after the flight took off.
Most hypocritically of all, the TSA's security theater wouldn't even have prevented the 9/11 attacks. In 2015, tests conducted by the Department of Homeland Security got forbidden items, including fake bombs, through security 95% of the time. 2 years later, the TSA had improved dramatically, only failing about 80% of the time. If they're not catching fake bombs, they're certainly not catching the box cutters and butter knives that were used on 9/11. Now, you might have heard the story about NASA spending billions of taxpayer dollars to develop a pen that works in zero gravity. That story was false, but the TSA has spent billions of taxpayer dollars to prevent hijackings. Meanwhile, nowadays, all pilots have to do is lock the door to the cockpit. And yet, we're still taking our shoes off at the airport.
But what they don't tell you is that saying, okay, now you have to take off your shoes, just means that you're going to incentivize people who would be doing something to shift to something else. So one security expert described it this way. Having people take off their shoes is like saying, last time the terrorists wore blue shirts, so we're going to scan everyone who is wearing a blue shirt.
So what if we could press a big red button and eliminate the TSA? What would happen?
Exactly what airport security might look like absent the TSA. That's something that is an open question. But like any other market, we would expect to see competition. We'd also be likely to see people innovating, but we'd be very much likely to see a much more efficient, much less expensive, and my guess would be a much less invasive security experience.
And perhaps a return to what airports used to be. Dynamic gathering places where people and cultures from all over the world met and ate and drank, where kids could run up to their parents returning from business trips and give them a big hug. And while airports in other countries aren't quite that open, their private security systems are much better.
So using lesser technology and smaller budgets, we find that private companies are actually able to provide more effective airport security. So what does that look like, given that flying is very safe? How do you measure efficacy? And the answer to that is, again, look at how it is that people pass the tests. So when you attempt to get things that you're not supposed to take through airport security, what agencies catch them? And time and again, private agencies catch materials much more often than the TSA.
It's been more than 20 years since 9/11. There has been one hijacking of a plane in the US since. A small aircraft at low altitude over unpopulated Alaska. The hijacker was pushed away by the pilot and restrained by other passengers. And yet we're still taking our shoes off at the airport. Government programs and agencies thrive on fear. And as Milton Friedman said,
there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. And the TSA is a prime illustration of this.
What do you think of the TSA? Will it ever go away? Tell us your airport horror stories in the comments. Or if you disagree, argue why we need the TSA. Just consider what its 54,000 employees and $8 billion budget could be doing instead of groping passengers, collecting spare change, and enforcing a no-fly zone over Disney World.